Welcome to Chapter 33, our final chapter in this semester, looking at inflation, disinflation, and deflation. I'm Mr. Rodman here to take you through it. Hope you find this helpful. What are we going to look at in this chapter? Well, we've talked about inflation before. How can you not talk about inflation when it comes to unemployment? This is going into a little more depth on inflation. We've got a couple of key graphs, especially as it relates to loanable funds, which we did look at, if you remember, back in Chapter 31, in looking at this whole idea of long run and monetary policy, and looking at the impact of a monetarily neutral policy, long run, but effective in the short run. So we're going to take a look at an inflation tax. We're going to look at hyperinflation. We'll look at the costs of inflation, disinflation, and what are the aspects of deflation that we are concerned about when it comes to economic policy. And then, like I said, we'll wrap it up with our last three graphs for the semester here in AP Macroeconomics. So thanks for joining me, and let's hop right into it. Let's talk about loanable funds. This is a hypothetical market, and the idea here is that you're looking at the demand for funds that are necessary in order to borrow and get money from lenders, financial institutions, banks, and that sort of thing, in order to loan money out to consumers and businesses and the government in terms of what funds are available. So think of it that way. The loanable funds market is really that collection of funds that are available either through the government putting money in, or the banks, adding to the idea of a monetary base, looking at this in terms of the government, the Fed is going to buy bonds, that's contributing to the monetary base, provided that banks then use it to loan out money. If they don't make those loans, then obviously there's a problem in the system that needs to be corrected, and that is trying to encourage banks to loan out cash. This was a problem in 2008 as well in the recession. We're seeing it's a problem now here in 2020 during this pandemic. Banks don't want to loan out cash, and they certainly don't want to loan it out to anybody who would be questionable borrowers. They don't want them to have bad debt, to lose their investments as a result of a bad loan. So they're really much more skittish about making those loans, and that's exactly the opposite of what the government really wants them to be right now. So that's why the loanable funds market is so important here, because that money is only contingent, it's only effective when you look at the banks and financial institutions that are lending the money out. If they're holding on to it, or they're tightening the parameters by which they loan out that money, then that's a bigger problem. And that won't help the situation at all. It actually contributes to the problem, exacerbates the issues. The interest rate, as we've talked about before, this is a price essentially in terms of money that's borrowed. You would pay back this whatever the calculation is. So you would multiply the funds that are being borrowed times the interest rate to determine how much, in addition to the initial loan, you would need to be paying back, and the lender would be charging that. Now, who sets those rates? Obviously, the Fed hasn't set the rates, and then the banks can charge that prime rate to your best customers, or they can charge a higher rate depending on your level of credit. So those are important to keep in mind, because we're going to take a look at both of those here in this chapter. Now we get to key graph 32, and again, you'll need to copy these down in your graphing notebook. So now be a great time to hit the pause button on this video, and then when you come back, I will explain a little bit more about the loanable funds market. Hopefully you had a chance to put that in your graphing notebook for the key graph, so that's great. This is key graph 32. It's the loanable funds market, which is really important when you're looking at what's going to happen to government spending and this crowding out effect we always hear about. There's always a question on the exam related to that, either a multiple choice or FRQ. You don't want to have to worry about the FRQ this time around, but the idea is it can impact interest rates, and the crowding out effect of government spending can have an impact too. And we'll take a greater look at that when we get to the next key graph. But in this one, we're just looking at a basic supply and demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, the supply of funds that are available from different institutions, different lenders, financial institutions, that are loaning that out. And then the demand curve, downward sloping demand curve, based on a higher interest rate, the quantity of loanable funds that is demanded is going to be smaller than at a lower rate. If the real interest rate is much lower, you're going to have a greater demand. And this follows the laws of supply and demand, as we've talked about before. Now, these will meet at equilibrium. We will have a market created for these loanable funds at equilibrium, an interest rate that is charged at R, and a quantity of those loanable funds at Q. That is essentially showing us how the interest rate is informed based on this equilibrium, and the quantity as well. So kind of amorphous in terms of, okay, well, what do those numbers mean? Well, there aren't any numbers here. It's looking at how do we get to the real interest rate that we're looking at. We see it here at a market that's created between where supply and demand cross at equilibrium, and then the quantity of loanable funds as well. So downward sloping demand curve is what we see here, with upward sloping supply curve in terms of that, and where they meet essentially becomes that market. Now, when government steps in to borrow money in order to for fiscal and monetary policy, the idea is, well, where are they creating this money? Well, when it comes to fiscal stimulus, they're borrowing money. So you're having to borrow money in order to pay for that. You're going to have to finance that through the Treasury Department. And in a lot of cases, we're selling bonds. We're selling bonds to pay for that. So, that's where, we have a lot of investors domestically, but we have a lot of investors internationally that also address this. So both of those are happening in this particular market. But the idea here is when government is borrowing even more money than they were before, it essentially shifts this demand curve, and it's a greater demand for these loanable funds, which ultimately raises the interest rate of those funds. And that's unfortunate, because when you're private industry, you have a real problem when the government is competing with you for those resources that you want to use in order to build new manufacturing facilities or new technologies, that sort of thing. And you can't get access to that cash, or you definitely don't get it at the rate you thought you would because of the higher interest rate, which is what you see here. So the quantity of loanable funds, the idea here is when you're looking at this, the quantity would be greater because obviously the interest rate is greater. But government is essentially crowding out the possibility of what private industry would normally be able to borrow at when it came to, especially at the lower interest rate. They're going to pay more if they can even get a hold of the cash. And that really makes them resource deprived, which you've got the government competing against you for resources you need in order to run your business. And this creates this crowding out effect that we see in key graph 33. So here, again, pause the video to jot this down in your graphing notebook, key graph 33, and I'll be right back to talk more about it. Okay, so key graph 33, looking at this crowding out effect of the loanable funds market. So again, we have upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve, but now we have an additional shift in demand as a result of this government spending that we saw in the last slide. If you recall, the government borrowing money is essentially shifting, and they're going to be paying a higher rate for that, but essentially shifting the loanable funds, the interest rate as a result of this greater demand. Now, business is competing for that, which is unfortunate, because the idea here is that business is not going to be able to pay for as much of that quantity as the government will, and they're all going to pay a higher rate as a result of it. So it really does kind of crowd out the private industry from being able to have access to that money, access to those funds, which is unfortunate. And so ultimately what that will lead to, as you can see here, is a supply curve shift to the left, ultimately leading to an even higher rate than what you're paying now. And that's unfortunate because there's only so many funds out there. So business doesn't necessarily like a lot of government spending in this capacity unless they're benefiting from it directly, because of the concerns that it is going to not just compete with them, but also raise rates in the marketplace, and they're going to be competing for access to capital, and that is not something that you necessarily want. Now, as I said, the idea here in the assumption that government actually steps in and cuts regulations or does something that actually increases, cuts taxes, for instance, that can increase private savings, that makes the loanable funds even greater, gives us greater access to the loanable funds market because people have saved their money instead of going out and spending it. They're putting it into their bank accounts, and as a result, there's more money that lenders can actually loan out. That helps because the idea here is the supply curve shifts to the right, leading to a lower interest rate, which is what you see here, and that's encouraging more growth in investment and of business and private industry, which they love. That's encouraging them to do that and to do it at a lower rate, which ultimately leads to our key graph 34 that you see here. Take a second to write it down, hit the pause button, if you will, to copy it down in your graphing notebook, and I'll be right back to talk about it. So again, in key graph 34, we're looking at an increase in loanable funds. There's more money out there because more households are saving. If they're saving, that means they're leaving the money in the bank, and that means barring a reserve requirement and keeping that money there. The rest of it can be loaned out, and so lenders can do that. And not only can they do that, but they have greater access to that, which ultimately for business and private industry, that's more access to capital. Not only more access to capital, but then you have a lower interest rate in which to access that capital. So it's a win-win. There's more money out there. It's at a lower rate. It encourages business and private in industry to really to invest in more capital during this time because there's more money out there. So it's a win-win when people save. Now, the downside of this is, what are we seeing more and more, is that people don't save. They're not saving as much as they are anymore. So this is a harder one to find for lenders to see more a greater increase in supply of loanable funds. You just don't see as much of that anymore because our economy is 70% on people going out and spending things, consumer spending and consumption spending, and this is what makes the economy today, and that is not helpful for the supply of loanable funds. But it is obviously helping with demand, but not necessarily bringing down rates or increasing the quantity of funds that are available. Okay, so there is an activity related to this. It is 5-7, which talks about the crowding out. And if you would take a look at that, I know you've got that to do this week. And then check the answers on Google Classroom, and then again, email me or come to our Zoom class session to talk about any questions that you have. I think you'll find that helpful on the crowding out effect. Okay, so let's move on. Krugman talks about this idea of inflation and the impact of that inflation rate. We've seen a lot of examples of what we call hyperinflation, which we'll get to in a minute. But this is a good example of instability in the inflation rate. We have not seen this type of inflation, luckily, knock on wood. But Brazil is a good example of one that's just been through the roof over time, and there's not a lot of stability here. Now, the IMF really does, the International Monetary Fund really does try to help countries in terms of establishing inflation rates and CPIs and generic indicators with real GDP and whatnot that are trying to keep their economy stable. This is not an example of that. This is an example of a country in which you had kind of all over the place, and this leads to not just financial instability; it leads to political instability. So then that's when you see a lot of people kind of taking their democracy into their own hands and going to the streets. Demanding new leadership, as we saw. I think Puerto Rico was doing that with a couple of things that were going on there, and post World War II, we saw this in Germany in terms of the economic situation, which is what led to the rise of Hitler in Germany because of the instability of the economy. Now they were having to pay war reparations and all that kind of thing, but they also had business was really tough there, and inflation was just through the roof. And that led to this idea of hyperinflation. When your money is worth so little that it's better for the kids to use it as building blocks, or for, in some countries, people used the money as to burn it as heat, because it was a better investment than just hanging on to it. That's not a good sign for your country economically or politically, and that can be very dangerous in that regard. So the whole idea of what we see here with Brazil is the importance of stability in the inflation rate. And the Fed really does try to look at that Phillips curve we talked about in the last chapter, to gauge, at least short run, what's the relationship between unemployment and inflation. How can we keep each at bay without, shifting the curve outward, shifting the Phillips curve outward? That's not a situation where you really want to get into. So that can be very dangerous, as you can imagine. But inflation almost acts as a tax, if you think about it. If inflation is rising in that capacity that quickly and it's that unstable, it really is. Krugman talks about this idea of an inflation tax. Essentially, the real value of money is essentially because inflation is being caught up in this wave that people are having to pay more for products that, yesterday it wasn't even worth that. This leads to the idea that it's more of a tax than anything, because the value of those resources themselves didn't go up. It's all about inflation, and that really is dangerous when the value of the resource is that way, because or the value of the resource, not the real value, but the value of the resource itself is inflationary. Again, that leads to that stability that we saw in the previous graph, where people are going to call for more leadership or new leadership as a result of this. That's not a good situation to be if you're in charge. So that's really where the Fed and in our country, and then the IMF in a lot of other countries, is really trying to stabilize those types of economic indicators, because the real loser is going to be everybody in the country, not just the leadership, as a result of that. So it really is dangerous in terms of who wins and who loses. So you got to be careful there. Now remember, nominal interest rate and real, the difference, anytime you hear nominal and real, the idea of nominal is that inflation is included in that. So anytime, whether it's the nominal GDP and real GDP, whether it's the nominal interest rate and real interest rate, inflation is included in nominal. The real rate takes inflation out of it. So always keep that in mind. The nominal is always going to include inflation. The real is never going to include inflation, no matter what it is that you're talking about economically. So that's important. And the winners, are there really winners in this type of situation? Not really. I think everybody loses in this capacity. There's not really anybody that is going to win from higher inflation, which is why the IMF and the Fed in our country really try and address this in trying to at least adjust rates to a point that keeps inflation at bay. And we saw this a couple chapters back when I was showing you the interest rates that were adjusted based on the sale of bonds or the purchase of bonds. And the reason why the Fed is doing that and was so aggressive in like the late 90s, for instance, is because they were worried about inflation. They didn't want to get back to the days of the late 1970s where inflation was a problem, unemployment was a problem. That SRPC curve is shifting outward and outward so fast that they just couldn't, there was nothing they could do. And then you don't want to get into a capacity where your interest rates are so low that you get into Japan's problem, which is the liquidity trap. I've gone so low I can't go anywhere else. That becomes problematic too. So you definitely don't want to get into that quandary. That is definitely a problem. And then what comes along, we have the Fisher effect, which is this idea of expected inflation. Now it's always better. What is the old phrase? The devil you know versus the devil you don't. This is a good example here of expectations. The expectations game in terms of what's happening. You always want to know what is happening in the economy, and the more you can get and publicize expectations, the better off markets and the general public is in terms of what's coming next. So if you think inflation is going to be rising and you put that out there, and then inflation does rise, the idea is it doesn't have as great of an impact. Sure, it's still inflation. Mind you, it's still inflation, and you've got to deal with that. But at least it's out there in the public realm. It's not a surprise, gotcha kind of scenario. That tends to lead to a lot more volatility in the markets when it's more secret and then it becomes available. That's where there's really a lot of concern. So in this example, and this is a pretty extreme example, okay, you're going from 0 to essentially 10% in expected inflation. The idea here is if there is anticipated inflation and the demand is going to be inflating and supply is going to be inflating, the idea is supply and demand are going to, if it's out there as an expectation, the idea is that they will essentially they'll be baked in. Okay, the idea here is that there's not going to be a lot of surprises in the marketplace in terms of trying to address this, because the expectation is out there already, so you don't have to worry about it as much in terms of oh my gosh, it's a 10% inflation rate, holy cow. And that's a pretty extreme amount. Usually you're talking like 2%. Oh, we're expecting a 2% inflation rate. The market's hardly even going to move on a 2%. But if you said 10%, they definitely, you get a lot of raised eyebrows on that one. And then if it comes in at less than 10%, the idea is that everybody wins, because you're looking at it going, oh, well, it was 6%. Well, we were expecting 10. So this is good news, right? The expectations game is never more present than when it comes to finance. Now, it's important to note, going back to this idea of the Fisher effect, that when you have expectations around inflation, essentially any nominal interest rate one is going to when you have the expectation of inflation raising the nominal interest rate, it's going to do that one for one. So what you see here is when you have supply, for instance, rising at an expected inflation rate of 10%, you're going to see demand also in that expected impacted by that expected inflation. So supply and demand essentially hitting the expectations of inflation at the same time, that essentially doesn't have an effect on the real interest rate, because it's all inflationary. So that's where the expectations game is so important, because if people know, well, this is really the real interest rate is actually as a result of the nominal interest rate as a result of inflation, the real interest rate is unchanged, then there aren't other concerns about supply chains and what resource costs are going into this and the problems that they may have there. If it's inflationary, the idea is that it's a one for one in terms of that expectation, and as a result of that, because it's baked in, people are less concerned. I mean, obviously they're concerned about inflation, but less surprised about that in terms of having to take additional action, because they know that the Fed's on it, the Fed's all over it, trying to address it. And we haven't seen anything, since the days of the 70s that have been repeated. We've learned a lot of lessons since then. We also have a lot more data and a lot more metrics today to help with that. So I think that's made a big difference as well. All right, so costs of inflation. It's the shoe leather costs is kind of an old term, but Krugman talks about this in terms of how much is it going to cost for me to continue to run back and forth to the bank to get more money. Now, technology has changed. Innovation is amazing, and we have a lot of electronic payments today that we don't need to do that anymore. But that's one of the terms that's used to this inflation tax, the idea of having to pay more for things as a result of inflationary pressures. Menu costs is another example. How much does it cost to change the price on a menu? Now today, again, innovation and technology, we can print menus at home. I mean, there's a lot of changes to menus. Okay, you need to laminate them and whatnot, but the idea is menu costs are much cheaper now than they used to be. You don't have to go to a printer anymore and have a printer print them and that kind of thing, laminate them and all that. So much of that you can do at home. So the menu costs have gone down greatly, but the idea is the same. How much does it cost you in time and effort and resources to change your menu every time the costs change for your products, and you have to pass that along to your customers. So that is significant there. And then unit of account costs are really concerned, because this what are we using as a unit of account? This is the concern that money isn't a reliable measure of value, and that's a concern probably greater than the other two today, because when you have inflation, you're worried about, well, what's the value of a dollar? And we know, studying net present value, the value of a dollar today versus the value of a dollar 2 years from now, I'd rather have the dollar now. Why is it that so many lottery winners, take the lump sum and don't take the, however much money for the next month for the next 20 years? Why don't they take that approach? Well, because of net present value, the idea that my money is worth more now, and not to mention I could invest that money in a lot of other things that would probably make even more money for me as a result, and make up the difference. Probably well over, probably even make more money as a result of it. So that's really important here in terms of that particular aspect. Now, we'll talk for a second about deflation, this idea that's mentioned at the bottom of the slide here, the idea that there's a negative rate of inflation. And this is more hypothetical than what we would see today. We're not in a depression era where we have to worry about prices falling for goods because the cost of resources is dropping. If anything, we don't see that as much. We see inflation kind of cutting back. That's more disinflation than the deflationary pressures that we see here in terms of how that plays out. The effects of unexpected deflation, the idea of the cost of resources falling and therefore the cost of goods is falling, is looking at the reduction in aggregate demand. That's going to lead to even more problems when you are in a recession than you had before. As you can see here, intensifying an economic downturn. A nice way to say you're making the recession even worse, which isn't a situation that you necessarily want to be in. But the idea is the same. Always focused on zero bound. You can't go below zero, and do you get into that liquidity trap that we talked about with Japan? You definitely don't want to have that. That liquidity trap is essentially what we see here. You take it to zero, well then where can you go? And Japan's only other option was to borrow money and spend like crazy, and more fiscal policy than monetary. Because why? They had lowered rates for so long as a political measure, and some people were even saying, the last couple of years have kind of been like that. Anytime the Fed tried to increase rates, the president, tweeted something, or somebody in Congress was saying something. And the concern there is you go low to zero. Zero bound is as far as you can go, and then you're paying people to borrow money, which doesn't sound like a very good return on investment in terms of what we see there. So the inflation rate, looking at that idea of the inflation rate and the short-term interest rate, you can see there's a lot of similarities and a few differences in spots, but the idea is there in terms of that expectation. Now, over time, the inflation rate year over year, this is looking back to the 90s and early 2000s. You can see the recession here in blue and the impact that it had in 2008, 2009. In terms of those gains, we start to see upticks in 2011 into 2012, but not the highs of CPI that we saw here in the early 90s. That was leading into that recession and the inflation or the recessionary pressures that we saw there. So the blue columns being the recessions of 1990, 91, of 2001, 2002, and 2008 into 2009. But you can see a lot of these, a lot of the CPI, a lot of the changes in the inflation rate and the expected or anticipated inflation we see here, and it definitely mirrors what's happening, which shows you they really keep an eye on this sort of thing. They're not just an amorphous being out there not focused on it. I mean, the Fed really in the 90s rates were high because they were trying to fight inflation, which also was rising, and they were. And they were effective for the most part. You also had a lot of money out there from the dot-com boom, a lot of money chasing goods, and the concern there. That was more here, but the idea was the same. You had a lot of people out of work coming home from the Persian Gulf War, and the Fed was trying to address that. Congress and the president trying to do so as well, but a little late to the game in trying to see it in terms of making that happen. And then I think they've done a better job since that time period. That was kind of really the last time we really saw inflationary pressures get that high. Then in these recessions, you're dealing more with unemployment than you are with inflation in that respect. And then lastly, looking a little deeper at the CPI of the 2008-2009 recession, you can see in terms of CPI overall, and then kind of the change in rates in terms of what you see there, the short-term nominal rate and the inflation rate as a result of that. Kind of all over the place, but then coming back to really, it's hard to tame a beast when you don't know when you're in a recession until you're already there, and you don't know that you're coming out of one until you've already emerged. So those are always difficult situations to be in. Okay, so the last activity that you have is 5-5, looking at monetary and fiscal policy, real GDP, and I've posted that as well as the answers with explanations on Google Classroom, so do take a look at that if you would. And then again, come to the Zoom class or email me if you have questions related to that. There are also sample questions for the end of this unit, and those are listed. Those are listed on Google Classroom, and the answers will be posted there as well, but they're here as well for you if you need that. And believe it or not, that closes out the end of our chapter, of Chapter 33, and the end of macroeconomics for the year. Because as you know, Unit 6 isn't going to be tested, so we'll be teaching that after the AP exam, and then going from there. So I hope you found this helpful. Definitely come to class and on Zoom and email me if you have any questions. And as always, I'm happy to take your questions and try and address them. Work through the take-home quiz as well. And then we will see you in the afternoon on the Zoom calls, and live the 5.